Like-minded people are drawn to literary communities. To visit the Wordsworths and Coleridge became a pilgrimage to younger writers. We think of Thomas de Quincey, author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, who eventually relocated to be near the Wordsworths when they lived in the Lake District. And indeed, he blamed his own drug addiction on Coleridge's influence. Percy Bysshe Shelley made the journey to the north in 1811 and was devastated not to meet Coleridge or Wordsworth, but only to find Robert Southey at home. A similar visit makes its way into the first edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1798 in two of the poems. We have in fact met William Hazlitt before. Wordsworth gives him the name of Matthew in the poems Expostulation and Reply and The Tables Turned. Hazlitt remembered that the first time he heard Coleridge speak, I quote, "The light of his genius shone into my soul, like the sun's rays glittering in the puddles of the road." He credits Coleridge with helping him acquire a language to express himself, and of course Hazlitt would go on to be a highly regarded critic and prose author. But you will get a sense reading this that Hazlitt's opinion on these authors very much changed. Virginia Woolf says of Hazlitt's work that as we read, we become acquainted with his whole gamut of grudges and grievances. He turned against these authors bitterly. Where Hazlitt writes that in our youth we are clothed and fed and pampered with our good spirits, he's suggesting a naivety. It's almost as if he thinks he was once duped by Wordsworth and Coleridge, won over by their sheer charisma. Much of his later disappointment was political, that the two older figures had become conservative while Hazlitt had retained his radicalism. He had never abandoned the idea of social change and was very impatient with authors who felt that this was now impossible. The change that Hazlitt identifies in Wordsworth and Coleridge is something they are aware of themselves because it informs the two dialogic poems of 1802, Dejection and Ode, and the poem which we usually know for short as Wordsworth's Immortality Ode. Wordsworth and Coleridge in these poems articulate a sense that their vision was failing. A few weeks ago we discussed the idea that Coleridge's Dejection articulates disappointment with pantheism, a feeling that its vision had failed him. Something similar runs through Wordsworth's Immortality Ode. What's remarkable about this pairing of poems is that it's not simply a case of one new poem coming along and showing the influence of an earlier complete text. These were protracted periods of composition, with each poet responding to the work of the other in process.
There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more.
So the story of these two texts begins in early 1802. By March 1802, Wordsworth had composed the first four stanzas of the Immortality Ode, but he got stuck at the point at which he expresses the philosophical crisis of the poem, where he says, "Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream?" He couldn't answer it. He didn't know how to go on with the poem. Something like Coleridge is saying in Dejection, Wordsworth feels like his earlier philosophy has failed him. The following month, in April 1802, Coleridge composed the Letter to Sarah Hutchinson, which would later be revised as Dejection and Ode. He completed this work, with the final version of the poem appearing, as we said earlier, in October 1802 in a newspaper. Finally, in March 1804, Wordsworth, looking back over the recent experience and over the completed version of Dejection, continued and completed the Immortality Ode. This gives rise to two poems which often echo each other. On Moodle, I put up an important handout which outlines some of the instances of common phrasing, common shared themes between the two poems. This is important to us, not only in relation to understanding these two canonical works, but also when we go back in tutorial discussion to look at how Dorothy's journal entries inform William Wordsworth's poetry. Because this is the kind of work I would like to do in tutorials, to examine how particular phrases and ideas from Dorothy's journals find their way into Wordsworth's poetry, in the same way that particular phrases from Wordsworth and Coleridge find their way into the others' poems.